Chapter 1. Rest in Peace. A small group of people stood around the grave. The coffin had just been lowered into the ground. The priest started speaking. "We give our sister to God, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in hope of her rising again." Jonathan listened, but the priest spoke so quickly it surprised him. He thought these words would be slow and serious. Maybe the priest had done so many funerals that he didn't feel the words anymore. Jonathan looked at the other people. They were all much older than him. One woman stared at another grave, and another wiped her eyes. The sun was shining, and it was warm for April. Birds flew back and forth in the trees. It all felt so normal, not like the sad, serious event Jonathan expected. But Aunt Mary would have liked it. She was always practical and simple. Jonathan smiled a little at the thought and turned his attention back to the priest. "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all." "Amen," the priest said. There was a short silence. Then everyone walked back to the church. "Mr. Keeble," the priest said, shaking Jonathan's hand firmly. "Have you arranged everything with the stonemason? Will you stay, or do you need to go back to London?" "I have to leave soon," Jonathan said. "Work is busy right now. Aunt Mary's passing came at a difficult time." "Yes, it's sad. I spoke to her just 2 weeks ago. She was so well and full of plans for the next church jumble sale. She even showed me some things she was going to donate." "Oh dear, I sound like I'm asking for her things." Jonathan smiled. "Don't worry, Vicar. Nothing is going anywhere for now. To be honest, I don't know what's in Aunt Mary's house. I stayed there as a child, but I haven't seen her since the 1980s. My family wasn't very close with her after the war." The priest turned to an older woman standing nearby. "Mrs. Smith, have you met Mr. Keeble yet? He's Mrs. Bruton's great-nephew. Mr. Keeble, this is Mrs. Smith. She helped your aunt with the house." Jonathan shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Smith. The lawyer mentioned you worked for Aunt Mary. Maybe you can help me look through the house. Could I have your phone number to set up a time?" Mrs. Smith wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. She looked about 60, younger than Aunt Mary, with a weathered face like someone who worked outside a lot. "Of course, Mr. Keeble. I'll help however I can. Mary, Mrs. Bruton, was wonderful. When my husband died, she gave me work and became a good friend. I can't believe she's gone. When I found her in the hall, it was such a shock." Jonathan frowned. "Oh, you found her? That must have been hard for you." "Yes," Mrs. Smith said, her voice shaking. "I visit every Friday afternoon to see if she needs anything. When she didn't answer the door, I used my key. She was lying at the bottom of the stairs. I thought she fainted, but she was already cold. I called an ambulance right away. The rest you know." The priest helped Mrs. Smith sit on a bench, and Jonathan patted her hand. "That must have been terrible, but you couldn't have done anything more. The doctor said she fell and broke her neck. She didn't suffer." "I know," Mrs. Smith said, crying. "But she was alone all night. I can't stop thinking about it." Jonathan shook his head. "We don't know when she fell, do we? It could have been Friday morning." "No, I'm sure it was in the evening," Mrs. Smith said. She was wearing her jewelry. She always dressed up for dinner. And the lights were on. She never used lights during the day to save money. That was her way. Jonathan nodded. He remembered Aunt Mary's routines. She was practical and always dressed for dinner, even when it was just her and Uncle Charles. By now, the other mourners had left. The priest stood up and looked at Jonathan. "I'd like to show you something before you leave," he said. "Sure," Jonathan said. "I have time before I head back to London. What is it?" "It's something your aunt gave to the church. A very special gift. A Bible." Mrs. Smith stood up. "It's beautiful, Mr. Keeble, but I need to go now. Call me when you're ready to go through the house." She handed him her phone number and left. Jonathan followed the priest into the church. They walked to a room at the back. The priest unlocked a metal cabinet and pulled out a large box. "Your aunt loved old books. She donated this Bible to us. We show it once a year, and it always brings in many visitors." The priest opened the box. Inside was a large old Bible with a leather cover. The pages had colorful pictures. "It's amazing," Jonathan said. "But it's not English, is it?" "No," the priest said. "It's German, from the 1700s. Your aunt said it had been in the family for over 100 years. She didn't want it sold to a collector." Just then, they heard a voice. "Vicar, are you here?" The priest sighed. "That's Miss Prince. She does the flowers. We'll have to look at this Bible another time." The priest put the Bible back in the cabinet as a woman entered the room. "There you are," she said. "You didn't forget our meeting, did you?" Jonathan decided it was time to leave. "Thank you for everything, Vicar. I'll be in touch soon." The priest nodded. "Safe travels, Mr. Keeble." Jonathan waved and quickly left the church. Chapter 2. Something is missing, Jonathan. Elvira remembered him clearly. The last time they'd met was at Cambridge, at the May ball at St. John's College. Her brother Giles had introduced them. Elvira hadn't known what to expect, but the evening had turned out to be magical. Music, dancing, champagne, and dreams of bright futures. Jonathan had been charming and a perfect gentleman, though not as romantic as he'd probably hoped. Now, 12 years later, he had suddenly called her. She was curious to know why. Elvira rang the doorbell of his flat. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Hello? Who's there?" It was Jonathan's voice, deep and confident, just as she remembered. She climbed the Art Deco staircase, her crocodile leather boots clicking on the steps. When she reached the open door, Jonathan greeted her warmly. "Elvira! My God, you look better than ever." "Jonathan, how are you, darling?" she replied, offering her cheek for a quick kiss. The flat was stunning. Soft pastel tones, elegant furniture, and tasteful art. Clearly, Jonathan hadn't lost his touch for style. "John, this flat is absolutely gorgeous," she said, exaggerating her admiration. Jonathan smiled and gestured for her to sit. "Enough of Cambridge nostalgia. Let's talk about now. By the way, how's Giles doing?" Elvira sighed. "Oh, Giles? He's been everywhere. Middle East, Venezuela, Russia, you name it. He's always chasing oil. I haven't seen him in years." Jonathan handed her a gin and tonic. And you, Elvira? What have you been up to? Elvira explained how she had studied secretarial work in Cambridge and eventually landed a job at Redfearn's Insurance. She was now working as an investigator. Jonathan raised his glass. Congratulations, Elvira. I think I've contacted the perfect person for this job. What job? She asked, curious. Jonathan sat down and grew serious. He told her about his life since Cambridge, how he had started a successful interior design business, inherited wealth after his parents' tragic death, and recently become the sole heir to his great-aunt Mary Bruton's estate in Challingstead. Jonathan mentioned his aunt's death, the funeral, and a beautifully illustrated German Bible she had donated to the church. But then he revealed the real problem. Several valuable books and manuscripts listed in an inventory of the estate were missing. Missing? Elvira frowned. Yes, Jonathan said. Mrs. Smith, my aunt's housekeeper, remembers the books and where they were kept, but when we checked the cabinet, it was empty. The keys were still in the lock, but the books were gone. Elvira thought for a moment. Do you think Mrs. Smith or the vicar could have taken them? Jonathan shook his head. No. Mrs. Smith has been trustworthy for years, and the vicar wouldn't have shown me the Bible if he had stolen anything. It doesn't make sense. Elvira inspected her boots, thinking deeply. John, I know someone who can help, but he's not from my company. He's with Scotland Yard. Jonathan leaned forward, intrigued. Who? Elvira smiled slightly. Inspector James Hudson. Chapter 3. Help at Hand. Inspector James Hudson was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning. He was having breakfast in his Baker Street flat. Miss Paddington, his housekeeper, had made scrambled eggs, and Hudson thought they were perfect. He glanced at the newspaper. The Prime Minister was on holiday, so Hudson figured there wasn't much happening in London. Maybe he could take the Bentley for a drive to Southend. It wasn't the most fuel-efficient car, but he loved it too much to let it go. Just as he was planning his relaxing day, the doorbell rang. Hudson sighed. He didn't expect good news. Hello, James, said a familiar voice when he opened the door. Hope I'm not disturbing you. Elvira? What a surprise. Hudson smiled. Come in. I'm just finishing breakfast. Elvira walked into the kitchen, looking cheerful. Is Miss Paddington here? No, she's gone shopping. Now, what brings you here, Elvira? Or is this just a social visit? Elvira sat down, her eyes sparkling. James, I think I found something interesting. It could be theft, or even murder. Hudson raised his eyebrows but stayed calm. Go on, he said, taking another sip of tea. Elvira explained about Jonathan Keeble's great-aunt, Mary Bruton. She had died from a fall down the stairs. However, some valuable books and manuscripts from her house were missing. Jonathan and Elvira suspected foul play. So, said Hudson, you think someone killed Mary Bruton to steal her collection? Exactly, Elvira replied. Hudson thought for a moment. How much are the books worth? At least £1 million, Elvira said. And they weren't insured. Hardly anyone knew about them. Hudson sighed. Elvira, You've just ruined my peaceful weekend." 2 hours later, Hudson and Elvira were at Jonathan Keeble's flat. Jonathan explained everything about his aunt's death and the missing books. Hudson agreed to help, but warned that he couldn't act officially yet. "I need time to review the documents," Hudson said. "Tomorrow we'll go to Challingstead Hall to investigate." Jonathan nodded. "Mrs. Smith, my aunt's housekeeper, will help us. She's very reliable." "Good," said Hudson. "While you two talk to Mrs. Smith, I'll inspect the cabinet where the books were kept." Before leaving, Hudson turned to Jonathan. "For now, call me Mr. Hudson. Let's not raise suspicions." The next day, Hudson, Elvira, and Jonathan drove to Challingstead Hall in Hudson's old Bentley. The weather was sunny and perfect for a drive. Mrs. Smith greeted them warmly at the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. She led them inside. Hudson inspected the staircase where Mary had fallen. The carpet wasn't fixed to the floor, so it could easily cause someone to trip. But Hudson thought Mary would have been careful. Upstairs, he entered the study where the books had been kept. He wore gloves and examined the cabinet and drawers. Everything was empty. On the bureau, he noticed an expensive silver cigarette lighter engraved with the initials PWM. Hudson frowned. Who did this lighter belong to? He put it in his pocket, feeling it might be important. Downstairs, Elvira and Jonathan had finished their conversation with Mrs. Smith. Hudson joined them for tea. "Not Earl Grey, I'm afraid," Mrs. Smith said apologetically, but the scones were excellent. Before they left, Hudson asked about the gardener, Patrick Morgan. Mrs. Smith said he had worked there for years, but mostly stayed outside. "He calls the garden his kingdom," she laughed. Hudson smiled but kept his thoughts to himself. On the drive back to London, he told Elvira and Jonathan, "I found some clues, but we'll need more time to figure this out." Chapter 4: A Day in the Country. The weather was perfect for a drive to the countryside on Sunday. The sky was blue, the air was fresh, and the temperature was already 22 degrees when Hudson saw Elvira arrive outside his flat. He opened the window and shouted, "Drive into the courtyard! There's no parking here!" Elvira carefully parked the car in the back, and while she gathered her things, lip gloss, sunglasses, hairbrush, and phone, Hudson stood by the Bentley, looking at his watch. "I make it 11:46, Hudson said. "Didn't we say 11:30? "Sorry, James. There was more traffic than I expected." Hudson smiled slightly, accepting her excuse. He thought, women, especially young, pretty women who spend half an hour on their hair when there's an important case to solve. Miss Paddington would have been angry. It took them 15 minutes to get to Jonathan's flat. He was already standing outside and waved them down. "Morning, Elvira. Morning, Mr. Hudson," he said, emphasizing the Mr. as he got in the back seat. "I called Mrs. Smith, and she'll meet us in front of the house. I hope the documents didn't keep you busy for too long." Hudson drove onto the main road. "We'll talk about that later. I need to focus on the traffic." For the next 30 minutes, Hudson carefully avoided other drivers and traffic lights. Finally, they were on the motorway, speeding at 70 mph. Hudson turned to Jonathan and said, "Yes, Mr. Keeble. Now, where were we?" "The documents." Did they keep you up late? Not at all, Hudson said. Everything looked fine. I'm not an expert on antiques, but I think those missing books might be worth more than my whole salary. He glanced at Elvira, who was searching through her handbag. James, I told you, about £1 million. Hudson smiled. That's our job at the yard, to find millions and get a small reward. It's a tough job. Jonathan felt embarrassed. Yesterday, Hudson, when you mentioned the old girl, I didn't understand. But now I see what you mean. This car is amazing. How did you get it? Hudson laughed. That's a long story, which I'll tell you after we figure out what happened at the hall. Soon, they arrived in Challingstead. The village looked just like every tourist expects of England. A big green, a pond with 2 swans, and cottages with roses around the doors. My God, Hudson said. I thought all this disappeared after the war. Where's the urban sprawl? It hasn't reached here yet, Elvira said. But it's coming. Give it 15 years and Challingstead will have a big highway to the city. Hudson saw an old man sitting on a bench, wearing a tweed suit and smoking a pipe. The 2 dogs beside him looked peaceful. This is unbelievable, Hudson thought. It's like stepping back in time. He rolled down the window. Excuse me, can you tell us where the pub is? We're new here. The old man looked surprised. Pointing with his pipe, he said, Straight ahead, first right. Hudson thanked him and laughed, imagining the man's thoughts. Bloody city people. Why don't they leave us alone? They reached the Red Lion pub. Hudson's Bentley didn't look out of place, but most of the other cars were German limousines or big 4-wheel drive cars. What do they call them in London? Hudson thought. Ah, Chelsea tractors. A good name. He smiled as he remembered a funny article about buying fake mud to make the cars look like they belonged in the countryside. Inside the pub, Jonathan ordered drinks and sandwiches. They sat at a corner table. No one seemed to notice their arrival, except for 2 young men at the bar, who looked at Elvira for a few seconds. You've made an impact, Hudson said. Elvira smiled, taking a delicate bite of her sandwich. James, don't I always? Hudson raised his glass, smiling. You'd do well at the yard. Probably too well. Jonathan, unaware of the teasing, asked, What do we do now? The plan hasn't changed, Hudson said. We meet Mrs. Smith at 2 o'clock, and then I'll look around the house while you keep her busy. But first, I need to talk to the landlord. Hudson walked to the bar and knocked on it. Excuse me, he called. Can I talk to the landlord? The barmaid looked worried. Mr. Dickinson isn't here right now. What's the problem? No problem, Hudson said, smiling. Just wondering if you have bed and breakfast. I'm thinking about a place in the country. Elvira and Jonathan looked surprised, but the barmaid quickly disappeared, and Mr. Dickinson appeared. Bed and breakfast, sir? No problem. Double or single? Single, said Hudson. Probably for Tuesday, but I'll confirm. Here's my card. They talked for a bit longer, and Hudson went back to the table. James, what are you doing? Elvira asked. Nothing to worry about, Hudson said. Just a feeling of mine. When they arrived at the hall, Mrs. Smith was waiting. After introductions, they went inside. The house was big and old with many rooms. Mrs. Smith led them to the stairs. "This is where I found my aunt," she said. "She fell down the stairs." Hudson nodded. "How old was she?" 75 in July, said Mrs. Smith. "But she was very healthy. I think she tripped on the carpet. I often told her it was a hazard, but she loved it." Mrs. Smith went to make tea, and Jonathan turned to Hudson. "Mr. Hudson, maybe you and Elvira should check the upstairs rooms. I'll look at the downstairs rooms. The books and papers I told you about are in a cabinet upstairs." Hudson slowly went upstairs, looking carefully at the carpet. It was not fixed to the floor. Someone could easily slip on it, he thought. He checked the rooms. The bedroom had a big window looking at the garden. He saw several pictures on the wall, family photos. One showed a man and woman with a young boy next to a Rolls Royce. It must have been Mr. and Mrs. Bruton. And the boy? Hudson looked closely. "It's Jonathan." He entered the last room on the left. It looked like a study, with bookcases, a desk, and a cabinet. The key was in the lock, and the drawers were closed. Hudson carefully put on latex gloves and opened the drawers. They were empty. He turned his attention to the desk. It had the usual things: envelopes, pens, scissors. He picked up a pen, expensive, and engraved with the letters CEB. Probably Mary Bruton's husband's pen. Just before leaving, Hudson noticed a cigarette lighter on the desk. It was silver, with the initials PWM. "I wonder who this belongs to," he thought. A voice called from downstairs. "Mr. Hudson, would you like some tea?" Hudson was about to put the lighter back, but stopped. He knew it didn't belong there. He slipped it into his pocket and went downstairs. After tea, Jonathan thanked Mrs. Smith, and they left the house. Back in the car, Hudson said, "You're lucky, Mr. Keeble. This is a beautiful house." Mrs. Smith added, "She had a gardener named Patty Morgan. He took care of the garden for years." Hudson suddenly stiffened. "Patty Morgan?" "Yes," Mrs. Smith said. "He has a little shed near the garden. He's Irish and he calls it his kingdom." Hudson raised an eyebrow. "Was he often inside the house?" Mrs. Smith thought for a moment. "I don't think so. He just worked outside." "Salt of the earth," Hudson said and ushered them into the car. "By the way, Mrs. Smith, I'd love the scone recipe." After they dropped Jonathan off, Hudson and Elvira headed back to London. Elvira looked at Jonathan and said, "Does Hudson owe us an explanation?" Jonathan nodded. "I feel like he knows something we don't." Hudson smiled. "It's simple. I think Mary Bruton didn't die from tripping, and the carpet wasn't Indian, it was Persian." Elvira wasn't happy with Hudson's teasing. "Stop playing games, James. What's next?" "Elvira, you'll find out if any of the books were sold at auction. Mrs. Bruton might have given them away. You can contact the auction houses, right?" "Yes," Elvira said coldly. "I have contacts. Jonathan, do nothing for a few days, but get Mrs. Smith's scone recipe," Hudson said, enjoying the mystery. Something serious happened here, he thought. As they got to his flat, Hudson saw Miss Paddington watching through the window. "Miss Paddington is back. I wonder what her weekend was like," he said. Elvira smiled politely and thanked Hudson for the day out. I'll contact you soon. Hudson smiled and waved as she drove away. I'm sure the company will love the results, he thought. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. It was shortly after 9 a.m. on Monday when Hudson walked into Sir Reginald's office. Is Sir Reginald back in town? He asked the secretary, holding a stack of papers. Hudson knew that getting along with the secretary would help him stay ahead at work. No, Inspector Hudson, the secretary replied. He called at 8 a.m. and said he wasn't feeling well. He won't be in until Wednesday. He's on sick leave. You've got plenty of time to finish that last report. Oh, and don't forget to send in your expenses. Bentley petrol isn't cheap. Hudson smiled. Thanks. You're a star. And if Miss Elvira Elliott calls, I'll be in my office, working on my expenses. He left Sir Reginald's office. Hudson was thinking about Mrs. Smith's gardener, Patty Morgan. Could he have hurt Mrs. Bruton and stolen books? It didn't seem possible. But who was PWM? As Hudson worked on old reports, Elvira called. James, we're on to something big. Do you remember that list John gave us? There was a signed Oscar Wilde play and a first edition of Alice in Wonderland with notes by Carol. Hudson pretended he didn't remember much. Vaguely, he said. Well, Elvira continued, excited, both of them are in Guilford's next auction in July. Hudson pushed aside the papers on his desk. That's interesting, but I need more than that to justify my travel expenses to Challingstead. Elvira was too excited to get upset. I called Guilford's right away. They couldn't give me the buyer's name, but I have some advice. Got your pen ready? Hudson took his time, pretending to look for a pencil. I'm ready. My contact told me that if I was looking for rare books, I should visit Blakeney's. It's an antique store near King's Road in Parsons Green. The address is 2 Galvina Road. Hudson nodded. Got it. Thanks, Elvira. I'm on my way. But what about me, James? I want to be there too. Sorry, Elvira. This case is too serious for amateurs. I'll be in touch. Hudson left and told the secretary, I'll turn in my expense forms later. I need to check something urgently. 30 minutes later, Hudson stood outside Blakeney's at 2 Galvina Road. The shop looked professional, with dark brown and green colors. The sign inspired trust. A bell jingled as Hudson entered. Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you? A man came out from the back. Hudson smiled. I was just passing by and thought I'd browse. The man smiled back. We sell antiques, paintings, and rare books. Most of the books are from the 1800s. Hudson looked at the shelves. Looks like this could be a gold mine. The man laughed. Actually, Mr. Blakeney passed away some time ago. I worked with him for 10 years before I took over. I kept the name because it was well known. Hudson nodded. I see. So, what's your name? Peter Manning. Here's my card. Hudson took the card. I live in the Lake District and come to London for work. I collect 19th century books. Have you tried the auction houses? Manning asked. Hudson frowned. What do you mean? Manning leaned in. If you're looking for rare books, check out Guilford's catalog. Let me show you a couple of entries. He handed Hudson a catalog with 2 books listed. Hudson looked surprised. Did you supply these books? Let's just say I bought them from someone who didn't know much about rare books. I'll be selling more soon. Hudson wasn't sure, but Manning's story seemed too good to be true. Time to back off and compare notes with Elvira. I have to go, but I'll be back tomorrow to look around, Hudson said, checking his watch. You're open tomorrow? Yes, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Call if you need anything. Hudson left the shop and drove back to Baker Street. At home, Miss Paddington was in the kitchen. Back early today, James? Miss Paddington? You never miss a thing, Hudson replied. But I've nearly solved the Challingstead mystery. Miss Paddington smiled. Is it murder? Let's not jump to conclusions, Hudson said. Hudson made a call to the Red Lion in Challingstead. The landlord, Mr. Dickinson, answered. Hello, Mr. Dickinson. I wanted to ask about a room for next week. You mentioned you don't get many bookings. Oh. That's right, Mr. Dickinson replied. I'm even thinking of closing the BB side. Last guest left without paying. Really? Who was it? Manning, from London. Owes me £80. Hudson's mind raced. It was almost certain Manning had stayed at the Red Lion on April 3rd. Hudson called Elvira next. Elvira, I'm sure Manning's our man. I'm meeting him tomorrow. I need you there with the list of missing items. Elvira's tone changed. I knew it. Where should we meet? Parsons Green Tube Station at 10 a.m. We'll head to Blakeney's together. Hudson then called Miss Paddington. The lamb's ready? Yes, she replied. But you have to make the phone calls first. Hudson went out to meet Elvira, and they drove to Blakeney's. No Bentley today? Elvira teased. They parked outside the shop, and Hudson gave Elvira a nod. Let's play it cool, he said. Manning greeted them. Mr. James, good to see you again. Did you look at the Guilford's catalog? Very impressive, Hudson replied. I brought Elvira along. Perhaps we can make a deal? Manning smiled and went into the back room. Hudson noticed a cigarette lighter on the tray. Manning returned with a Beatrix Potter book. This one's worth £50,000. Elvira was impressed, but then asked, Do you have anything by Dickens? I'm related to him and looking for an early copy of Copperfield. Manning seemed nervous, but Hudson didn't let on. I'm interested in that lighter, Hudson said, pointing to it. What's the price? Manning looked shocked. That's my lighter. I've been looking for it everywhere. Hudson's voice grew serious. I know where I found it, at Challingstead Hall. And by the way, I'm not Mr. James. I'm Inspector Hudson of Scotland Yard. Manning's face turned pale. Hudson showed his ID. I'm arresting you for the murder of Mary Bruton and the theft of books. You have the right to remain silent. Manning slumped into a chair. I need my lawyer. Elvira called the officers outside, and Manning was taken away. Hudson locked the shop and turned the sign to closed. Elvira was confused. James, how did you get the lighter? Hudson smiled. Mum's the word. It fell into my pocket by accident. Later that evening, Hudson joined Elvira and Jonathan for dinner. Jonathan asked, What did Manning say? Hudson leaned back, lighting a cigar. Manning grew up near Challingstead. He went there in late March to look at the books. Mrs. Bruton didn't want to sell, so there was an argument. He pushed her, and when she fell, he stole the books. His mistakes? Elvira asked. 1. He left his lighter behind. 2. He went straight back to London, which made it harder to trace him. Jonathan smiled. Thank you, James. Miss Paddington then asked, How did you get the lighter? Hudson laughed. It was a bit of luck. Elvira asked Jonathan, By the way, how did you get my phone number? There was an awkward silence before the phone rang. Miss Paddington answered it. It's Sir Reginald, she said, handing the phone to Hudson. Hudson listened to the growl on the other end. Hudson, tomorrow, 8 a.m. in my office.